She built that house with her own hands, every brick, every bill, every sleepless night. And yet that night, the son she had sacrificed her whole life to raise stood in the middle of the living room and told her, "Mom, move out." And that was just the beginning, because what Evelyn Whitmore was about to do would make that whole family regret it for the rest of their lives. If you're watching this story, don't leave. Subscribe so you don't miss the next shocking stories. Like now, and leave a comment with the city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled the world. See you at the end of this journey. I am 74 years old, and I have learned this truth the hard way. The people most capable of destroying you are not your enemies. They are the ones you loved long before you understood what love could cost. My name is Evelyn Whitmore, and what I'm about to tell you is the story of how I lost everything, and then decided I was not finished yet. I built Whitmore Agricultural Technologies from a borrowed desk in a rented office the size of a walk-in closet. This was 1978. I was 26 years old, 8 months pregnant with my son Nathan, and my husband Roland had just taken out a second mortgage on our tiny house in Clarksburg, West Virginia, to give me the startup capital I needed. The bank had laughed at me. My own father had told me I was embarrassing the family. Roland looked at me across our kitchen table with the mortgage papers between us and said, "Evelyn, I believe in you more than I believe in anything else on this earth." I never forgot that. Roland died 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. He left me with the company, the mansion we had built together in Reston, Virginia, and a son who had grown into a man I was still trying to understand. Nathan was 46 when all of this began. He had worked inside Whitmore AgTech for most of his adult life. Not because he built it, but because I handed him a seat at the table when he graduated college and asked me for one. I did not resent that. I wanted him there. I believed that family and legacy were the same thing, that blood made you trustworthy by default. I was wrong about that. It took me 74 years to find out, but I was wrong. The woman who helped me find out was named Clara. Clara Whitmore, née Baxter, had married my son 9 years earlier at a ceremony in Charlottesville that cost more than the first year of operating my company. She was smart. I will give her that. Sharp in the way that certain people are sharp, where you can feel the calculation behind their smiles before you can prove it. She dressed impeccably. She remembered names. She laughed at the right moments and went quiet at others. And in the early years, I told myself that she was good for Nathan, that she steadied him. I was wrong about that too. The first sign I noticed came in the spring of what I now think of as the last ordinary year. Clara suggested, in that particular way she had of suggesting things, which was really a form of quiet insistence, that I let Nathan take on more of the daily operational responsibilities at the company. "You've worked so hard for so long," she said to me one Sunday afternoon in the garden. Her voice was careful and soft. "Don't you think it's time to enjoy some of that? Travel? Rest?" I looked at her over my glass of sweet tea. "I enjoy working," I told her. She smiled. "Of course you do. I just mean, Nathan is ready. He's been ready for a while now." I did not say what I was thinking, which was, Nathan has been ready for the salary and the title. Whether he is ready for the weight is a different question entirely. Instead, I said, "We'll see how things unfold," and changed the subject. But I filed that conversation away somewhere in the back of my mind, in the drawer where I kept the things that did not quite add up. Over the following months, more things went into that drawer. Nathan began arriving at company meetings with prepared remarks. He had clearly not written himself. The language was too polished, too deliberate, and in one instance included a phrase, transitional leadership model, that I recognized from a consultancy report Clara had been reading the previous month. He began excluding me from certain vendor negotiations, citing what he called efficiency. He began copying Clara on internal emails that, by any reasonable standard of company hierarchy, had nothing to do with her. I watched all of it. I did not say anything yet. That is something I learned from 30 years in business. You do not speak until you know exactly what you are dealing with. Words, once spoken, cannot be retrieved. Evidence, once gathered carefully, cannot be ignored. But the evidence I was gathering at the office was almost gentle compared to what was happening inside the house. The mansion in Reston had always been my home as much as Nathan's. Roland and I had designed it together. The wide front porch, the kitchen with the double windows overlooking the garden, the study on the third floor where I had worked every Sunday morning for 2 decades. Nathan and Clara had moved in 6 years earlier, after their previous house sold, and they claimed they wanted more space. I had welcomed them. I had genuinely wanted them there. By the time I began to understand what was happening, the mansion no longer felt like my home. It felt like a place I was being quietly removed from, one small displacement at a time. Clara had redecorated the main living areas without asking me. Furniture I had chosen with Roland disappeared and was replaced with things that were sleek and modern and carried none of the weight of our history. The kitchen I had cooked thousands of meals in was reorganized in a way that made it impossible for me to find anything without searching. My study on the third floor, the room where Roland had proposed to me, where I had signed the papers making Whitmore AgTech a multi-million-dollar company, where I had sat alone the night Roland died and tried to remember how to breathe, was quietly converted into what Clara described as a creative workspace. She asked me about it afterward, not before. "I hope that's all right," she said. "We just needed somewhere for my painting things." I stood in the doorway of what had been my most private room and looked at the easels and the paint-stained drop cloths and the artificial lighting rig that had replaced Roland's old reading lamp. I said it was fine. I went downstairs. I sat in the kitchen I could no longer navigate, and I held my hands very still in my lap, and I waited for the feeling in my chest to pass. It did not pass for a long time. Still, I told myself it was livable, that family required compromise, that I was perhaps being too attached to things, to rooms, to arrangements of furniture that meant nothing in the grand accounting of love. Then came the evening in October. Nathan called me into the sitting room after dinner. Clara was already there, seated in a way that told me the arrangement had been discussed in advance. Nathan's face wore the expression I had seen him wear during negotiations he expected to win, controlled, almost apologetic in its confidence. "Mom," he said, "Claire and I have been talking." I sat down across from them. I folded my hands. "About what?" "About the house. About space." He paused, and I could see him choosing his next words the way a person chooses footing on uncertain ground. "We've been feeling a little crowded lately, and we think that it might be better for everyone if you found somewhere of your own." The room was very quiet. Outside, the October wind was moving through the trees I had planted the year Nathan started high school. "You'd like me to move out," I said. Not a question. I wanted to make sure there was no ambiguity between us. Nathan shifted slightly. "We thought maybe something in one of those nice retirement communities, or a condo, somewhere with a little less maintenance, more suited to what?" I asked. He did not answer immediately. Clara leaned forward. "Evelyn, this isn't about anything other than practical living arrangements. Nathan and I need room to— This is my house," I said. That stopped them both. My voice had not been loud. I had not raised it. There had been no trembling in it, no heat, nothing that would have satisfied them by suggesting I was losing composure. I simply stated it, quietly, and with the full weight of what it meant. "I know it can feel that way," Clara said carefully. "But legally, I said, this property is held in my name. The deed was signed by me in 1997. The renovations in 2004 and 2011 were funded through my personal accounts. I know exactly what the legal situation is." Nathan looked at the floor. "Mom." His voice was softer now, which was worse somehow. Softer in the way that people go soft when they've already decided the outcome and simply want the other person to cooperate. "We're not trying to hurt you. We just think— You think I should be somewhere else," I said. "We think it would be better." I stood up then. I was aware of the way my knees felt, the slight stiffness that comes at 74 that I had never mentioned to anyone, because I knew how it would be used. I stood up straight and I looked at my son, the boy I had driven to school in the sleet, the boy I had stayed up through the night with when he had pneumonia at 9 years old, the boy I had handed the keys of a $30 million company to because I believed in his future. And I saw clearly, maybe for the first time, that he was not the person I had believed him to be. Or perhaps he was. Perhaps this was who he had always been, and I had simply refused to see it because seeing it would have required me to grieve something I was not ready to grieve. "I'll think about it," I told him. I left the room. I walked upstairs to my bedroom, still mine, at least that, and I sat on the edge of the bed with a quietness inside me that felt like the opposite of peace. Not numbness, something sharper than numbness. I was thinking very clearly. My hands were steady. My breathing was slow. Because in 30 years of business, I had learned one thing that was more valuable than capital, more valuable than connections, more valuable than anything they teach in business school. Never let them see what you are actually thinking. And what I was actually thinking was this. Something had been wrong for longer than this evening. Tonight was the visible surface of something that ran much deeper. And whatever was underneath, whatever they had been building while I was not looking, I was going to find it. All of it. I was 74 years old. I had survived the collapse of 2 business partnerships, a national recession that nearly took the company down with it, the death of my husband, and 30 years of people looking at me and seeing only what they wanted to see. They looked at me and saw an old woman who could be managed. They had forgotten, or perhaps they never knew, that I had spent 50 years becoming someone who could not be managed. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in my reading chair by the window, and I watched the October trees move in the dark, and I began to make a list in my mind. Every strange thing I had noticed over the past months, every moment that had not quite fit, every file that seemed out of place, every number that had felt wrong in a meeting, every look that passed between Nathan and Clara when they thought I was not watching. The list was longer than I expected, and that was how I understood that this was not about privacy or practical living arrangements. This was something else entirely. I had no idea yet how far it went, but I intended to find out. The list I made in my head that night, I eventually wrote it down, not on my computer, not on anything connected to the company network. I bought a small spiral notebook from the drugstore 2 blocks from the Reston Library, paid cash, and brought it home tucked inside a grocery bag. I wrote in it only when I was alone, and I kept it behind the false back panel of the closet in my bedroom, the one Roland had built during the 2004 renovation, because he believed every person needed at least one place in their home that was entirely their own. He could not have known how right he was. I started with the things I had already noticed. The excluded meetings, the emails copied to Clara, the phrase transitional leadership model lifted from a consultancy report. Small things, individually. The kind of things you could dismiss if you were the type of person who needed to believe the best about the people around you. I had spent most of my life being that type of person. I was finished with it. The first real crack in the surface appeared 3 weeks after the sitting room conversation, on a Tuesday morning in early November. I was at the office earlier than usual. I had taken to arriving before Nathan did, which required leaving the house by 6:30, which meant waking at 5. Which was not difficult because I was not sleeping much anyway. I sat at my desk with coffee I'd made in the small break room and pulled up the quarterly financial summary that my CFO, a careful and meticulous man named Gerald Foss, had sent the previous Friday. Gerald had been with Whitmore AgTech for 19 years. He was the kind of person who triple-checked figures before submitting them and sent correction emails about his own mistakes before anyone else noticed them. So when I found a line in the summary that did not correspond to any transaction I had authorized, I did not assume Gerald had made an error. I assumed someone else had made a decision without telling me. The line read, Advisory Services, Baxter Consulting Group, $340,000. I sat very still and looked at that line for a long time. Baxter was Clara's maiden name. I picked up the phone and called Gerald directly. Gerald? I said when he answered. Tell me about the Baxter Consulting Group payment. There was a pause on his end, not a long one, but long enough. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, I understood that had been authorized through Nathan's office. When? The contract was signed in August. 4-month retainer for, the documentation described it as Strategic Transition Advisory Services. Strategic transition. There was that language again. Send me the contract, I said. Another pause. Nathan indicated the contract was, I believe the word he used was sensitive. He asked that copies be limited to, Gerald, my voice was quiet and very even. Who founded this company? You did, Mrs. Whitmore. Who is listed as majority shareholder and executive chairperson of record? You are. Then send me the contract. It arrived in my inbox 11 minutes later. I read it twice. The Baxter Consulting Group had been incorporated in Delaware 4 months earlier. Its registered agent was a law firm in Arlington, Virginia. Its described purpose was executive transition consulting and organizational restructuring advisory services. The contract had been signed by Nathan in his capacity as Chief Operating Officer. I turned to the last page where the authorized signatories were listed. Nathan Whitmore had signed for Whitmore AgTech. The signatory for Baxter Consulting Group was listed as C. Whitmore. Clara. I set the contract down on my desk and I looked out the window at the November sky, which was the color of old dishwater and promised nothing. My coffee had gone cold. I had not noticed. In 30 years of business, I had seen a great many things. I had watched competitors try to undercut me, partners try to absorb me, banks try to foreclose on me. I had watched men in expensive suits look past me in meetings to address the junior male colleague I had brought for note-taking. I had negotiated through the kind of adversity that left marks. I thought I knew what betrayal felt like. I was learning it had more layers than I knew. My own son had funneled $340,000 of company money into a company his wife had created 4 months ago. A company that existed, as best I could tell, for no reason other than to receive money from Whitmore AgTech through a channel that was almost, but not quite, too buried to find. I opened my notebook and wrote the amount down. Then I wrote the date of incorporation for Baxter Consulting Group. Then I wrote a question I already suspected the answer to. How long has this been going on, and how much more is there? The answer to that question took me 3 weeks to begin assembling, and what I found during those 3 weeks is the reason I stopped sleeping almost entirely. I had a contact, a woman named Diane Chu, who had worked in forensic financial consulting for 22 years before starting her own firm. I had helped her get her first major client years ago, when she was just starting out, and the client was a mid-sized agricultural distributor that had done business with Whitmore AgTech. We had stayed loosely in touch. I called her from my personal cell phone, from a parking lot 3 miles from the office, and I explained what I had found without explaining why. I need someone to look at a set of company financials, I told her, quietly. Nothing filed anywhere, nothing official, not yet. How sensitive? She asked. Very. How quiet? Completely. A beat of silence. Can you get me access to the records without going through your internal systems? I have my own administrative access codes, I said. I never gave them up. That was something Nathan and Clara had not accounted for. When Nathan was elevated to COO 3 years earlier, the company's IT department had issued him a new full-access credential set. He had assumed, and I had allowed him to assume, that this replaced mine. It did not. Gerald Foss, who was meticulous in all things, had flagged the question of my access to me privately, and I had told him to leave it unchanged. I had not been able to explain why at the time. It had simply felt like the kind of thing a person should hold on to. I gave Diane the access codes over the phone and told her I needed preliminary findings within 10 days. She called me back in 7. I was sitting in my car outside a grocery store when she called. It was 7 in the evening. I had told Nathan and Clara I was having dinner with an old colleague, which was not entirely untrue. Evelyn, Diane said. Her voice had the particular quality of someone delivering information they wished they did not have to deliver. How are you holding up? Tell me what you found. She told me. The Baxter Consulting Group payment was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that stretched back in its earliest form, approximately 14 months. It had begun small. Vendor payments reclassified under categories that were technically legitimate but difficult to trace without detailed reconciliation. Equipment purchases made at above-market rates from suppliers whose beneficial ownership, when Diane traced it through 2 holding companies registered in Nevada and 1 in the Cayman Islands, connected back to a trust that named Nathan Whitmore as a beneficiary. $340,000 for Clara's consulting company. But before that, there were equipment invoices totaling nearly $800,000 spread across 11 months. And before that, there was a real estate transaction, a property in Loudoun County purchased by the company ostensibly as a future operations site valued at $1.2 million that Diane had flagged because the assessed value of the property was $640,000. The difference went somewhere, Diane said. I haven't fully traced where yet, but there's a transfer from an intermediate account that I think you need to see. How much are we talking about altogether? I asked. There was a pause. What I can document so far, she said carefully, is somewhere in the range of $2.3 million. The number landed in the silence of my car like a stone dropped into still water. I watched the grocery store's automatic doors open and close for people who were buying milk and bread and toilet paper and living their ordinary lives, and I held my phone against my ear, and I did not say anything for a moment. Evelyn? Diane's voice was careful. Are you there? I'm here, I said. Keep going. There's something else, she said, and this one, I want you to be prepared. I said I was. I was not. Diane had, in the course of reviewing the financial records, found a series of emails that had been routed through a company server account that technically belonged to a dissolved subsidiary. They were not supposed to be accessible, and under ordinary circumstances, they would not have been. But the subsidiary's server had never been fully wiped, another oversight that Gerald's meticulous record-keeping had inadvertently preserved. And Diane, who is thorough in the way that only people who have seen the worst versions of corporate malfeasance can be, had pulled the archived files. The emails were between Nathan and a man named Philip Garrett. Philip Garrett was an attorney specializing in guardianship and conservatorship law. I made Diane read me the relevant sections twice because I needed to be certain I was understanding correctly. The emails outlined a strategy. The strategy involved establishing, through medical and psychiatric testimony, that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. The word they used was diminished capacity. They discussed the process for petitioning a court to appoint a conservator, in this case Nathan, who would then assume legal control over my personal finances, my medical decisions, and most critically, my shares in Whitmore AgTech. The emails discussed the need for documentation. Medical documentation specifically. They discussed which physicians might be approachable for the purpose of providing evaluations that reached predetermined conclusions. They discussed timing, waiting until the financial transfers were complete before moving forward to avoid scrutiny during the legal process. They discussed me as though I were a problem to be solved, a resource to be managed, an obstacle that age and careful manipulation would eventually remove. I sat in that parking lot for a long time after Diane finished reading. It was fully dark now. The November cold had begun to seep through the car windows. Evelyn, Diane said quietly, I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, I said. Keep everything. Document it all. Send me copies of everything to the personal account I'm going to give you right now. Not the one connected to the company, a personal one. Can you do that? Yes? And Diane, I need you to find me an attorney, not a business attorney. I need someone who handles elder law, estate litigation, and criminal financial fraud. Someone very good, and someone whose name is not connected to any firm that has ever done work for Whitmore AgTech. I know someone, she said. Her name is Margaret Osey. She's in D.C. She's handled 4 cases similar to this in the last 8 years, and she's won all 4. Call her tonight, I said. Tell her I'll need her. I drove home. I parked in the driveway of the mansion I had built with Roland, and I sat behind the wheel for 10 minutes, looking at the lit windows on the second floor where I could see the silhouettes of Nathan and Clara moving in what had been our family sitting room. I thought about Roland, about the way he used to squeeze my hand in meetings when things were going badly, not to comfort me, but to signal that he was paying attention, that he had not missed anything, that whatever I was about to do, he was going to be there for it. I thought about how much I missed having someone who was simply on my side without qualification. Then I got out of the car and went inside. Nathan was in the kitchen when I came through the door, standing at the counter with a glass of wine and his phone. He looked up. His expression shifted in that almost imperceptible way it had been shifting lately. A slight recalibration, the look of someone running a calculation. "How was dinner?" he asked. "Fine," I said. "Good to catch up." "You're later than I expected?" I set my keys on the hook by the door, the same hook they had hung on for 26 years. "We had a lot to talk about." He nodded. I could see him deciding whether to say something else. He settled on, "You look tired, Mom. You've been looking tired a lot lately." There it was. The first note in a song I now knew every word of. I looked at my son, his easy posture, his expensive wine, the house around him that I had paid for, the company and his phone that I had built, and I felt something I had not expected to feel in that moment. Not anger, not even grief exactly. Something colder. Something that had been forming in the parking lot outside the grocery store and had solidified on the drive home, in the 10 minutes I'd sat in the car watching his silhouette through the lit window. "I'm fine," I told him. "Good night, Nathan." I went upstairs. I took out my notebook. I added what Diane had told me to the pages already filling with my careful handwriting, and then I sat back and looked at what I had accumulated. It was enough to begin with. It was not yet enough to finish with. And finishing properly, finishing in a way that could not be undone or appealed or maneuvered around, required patience of a kind that was genuinely painful to maintain. But I had spent 50 years learning that the most important moves are never the fastest ones. The following week, I met Margaret Osei for the first time in a conference room in her firm's DC office on a Wednesday afternoon. She was in her early 50s, compact and precise, with reading glasses she kept taking on and off in a way that seemed unconscious. She read through the documents Diane had compiled without speaking for close to 30 minutes while I sat across from her and drank water from a glass someone had left on the table. When she finished, she took off her glasses, set them on the folder, and looked at me directly. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "what is your objective? I want to hear it from you in your own words before we discuss anything else." "My objective," I said, "is to stop what they're doing and expose it fully. Not just to recover the money. I want the full picture visible. Everything they planned, everything they took, everything they intended to take." "Why?" she asked, not challenging me, testing whether I knew. "Because if I only recover the money," I said, "the story they tell afterward is that there was a family disagreement over finances and it was resolved. That is not what this is. What this is, what they planned to do, was to remove me from my own life, strip me of the ability to make my own decisions, have a court declare me incompetent so they could take everything and leave me with nothing but a room somewhere and whatever they chose to give me." I paused. I will not allow that to be the story that quietly disappears. Margaret looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded, once, with the specific quality of someone who has heard a great many stories and recognized one that was real. "All right," she said. "Then here's what we need." What we needed, Margaret explained, was a case that operated on 3 parallel tracks. The first was the financial fraud, the documentation of the diverted funds, the above-market transactions, the payments to Claire's consulting company. Diane's work was already well advanced on this front, but Margaret wanted her own forensic accountant to verify and supplement it, because financial fraud cases lived and died on the quality of their documentation. The second track was the conservatorship scheme. The emails Diane had recovered from the archived server were significant, but not yet complete. We needed to know how far the plan had advanced, who else was involved, and whether the physician contacts Nathan had discussed with Philip Garrett had been approached. The third track was the most delicate, protecting my position at the company before they had the chance to move against it. If they're as far along with the conservatorship plan as these emails suggest, Margaret said, they may attempt to move relatively quickly. Once a conservatorship petition is filed, your ability to conduct company business becomes immediately complicated, regardless of whether the petition has merit. The filing alone creates a narrative. "I know," I said. "So we need to act before they file. We need to be in position before they know we're moving." I nodded. "How long?" "If everything goes as well as it can go, And in my experience, something always makes it go less well. I'd estimate 6 to 8 weeks to be fully ready. 6 to 8 weeks of going home every evening and sitting across from my son at the dinner table. 6 to 8 weeks of listening to Clara make small observations about how tired I seemed, how perhaps I was overextending myself, how the company would be in good hands if I ever decided to step back. 6 to 8 weeks of watching them believe they were winning. "I can do that," I said. Margaret almost smiled. I had a feeling. I drove back to Virginia that afternoon and picked up groceries on the way home because I had told Nathan and Clara I would make dinner. I made chicken piccata, which was Roland's favorite and which Nathan had always requested on his birthdays. I set the table and poured wine and listened to Clara talk about a gallery show she wanted to attend in Georgetown, and I answered Nathan's questions about a vendor contract with what sounded like my full attention, and at no point in that evening did either of them look at me and see anything other than what they expected to see. An aging woman, manageable, declining, running out of time. It is a strange thing to be underestimated so completely by people who live in your house and eat your food and know your face. There is something almost clarifying about it. When someone has decided what you are, they stop looking carefully. And when they stop looking carefully, you can move in ways they never anticipated, because they have already told themselves the story of how this ends. They were certain they knew how this ended. I had other plans. Over the following weeks, I began executing them with the same methodical patience I had applied to every major crisis in my company's history. I met with Margaret twice more, each time varying the location and telling Nathan and Clara different versions of the same vague social obligation. I reviewed Diane's updated financial findings, which had expanded the documented figure to just over $2.7 million across 18 months. I began the process, quietly, through Margaret, through structures that were legally bulletproof, of reasserting and reinforcing my position as the company's controlling authority in ways that would be immediately relevant if a court challenge was ever filed. And then, in the third week of December, something happened that I had not planned for and could not have anticipated. I came home on a Tuesday afternoon to find a car I did not recognize parked in the driveway. Inside the house, in the formal sitting room, Nathan and Clara were meeting with two men in suits. I heard Nathan's voice from the hallway as I came in, and something in his tone, urgent, slightly elevated, made me stop before I entered. "The timing has to be right," Nathan was saying. "She's been more alert than we expected lately. I don't want to trigger anything before—" He stopped. I had walked into the room. The two men looked at me. Nathan looked at me. Clara, who was seated on the sofa nearest the door, turned, and for a fraction of a second her face showed something she could not entirely contain. Not guilt, exactly, but a kind of rapid adjustment. The look of someone who has just realized the door they thought was locked was open. "Mom," Nathan said. His voice recovered almost immediately. "You're home early." "I live here," I said pleasantly. I looked at the two men. They were both in their 40s, both carrying the careful blankness of people in professional situations that have just become complicated. "I don't think we've met." "These are colleagues," Nathan said. "Business consultants. We were finishing up, actually," one of the men said, standing. He extended his hand toward me with a professional smile that did not involve his eyes. "James Corbett. It's a pleasure, Mrs. Whitmore." I shook his hand, looked at him directly, watched him not quite meet my gaze. "What kind of consulting?" I asked. "Organizational development," he said. "Wonderful," I said. "I'll need you to send your firm's documentation to my office, full scope of engagement, retainer structure, deliverables. Address it to my attention." Another micro shift, the same rapid recalibration I had learned to read in Clara's face. "Of course," he said. "Absolutely." They left within 10 minutes. Nathan walked them to the door, and I heard murmured conversation in the entryway that stopped when I appeared in the hallway, as though they were teenagers caught planning something they could not defend. Clara was still in the sitting room when I came back. She was looking at her phone with the studied casualness of someone who needed to look at something. "Business consultants," I said. "Nathan has been exploring some structural options," she said without looking up. "Nothing finalized. I'd like to be included in those conversations, I said, given that it's my company. She looked up then. And there it was, that flash of something, there and gone, replaced by the careful smile. Of course, Evelyn. You know Nathan values your input. I nodded. I went upstairs. I called Margaret from the bathroom with the water running. They're moving faster than we thought, I told her. I need to know if we can accelerate the timeline. There was a pause on her end. What happened? I told her. All right, she said. Yes, I think we can move some things up, but Evelyn, I need you to understand something. Once we move, it becomes visible. They'll know you know. I understand that, I said. Are you ready for that? I stood in my bathroom with the water running and looked at my reflection in the mirror. 74 years old, gray-haired, tired in the bones in a way I did not let myself acknowledge most of the time. And I thought about Roland, about the mortgage papers on the kitchen table, about the word believe. I've been ready for a long time, I said. I was 74 years old, and I had spent that entire time becoming someone you did not want to be standing across from when the truth finally came out. They were about to find out what that meant. Margaret Osei did not work the way I expected an attorney to work. I had dealt with lawyers for 30 years, corporate counsel, contract specialists, litigation partners billing at rates that made Gerald Foss wince visibly every time he saw an invoice. I knew the type. Careful, methodical, always 2 steps behind the problem, and charging you generously for the privilege. Margaret was different. She worked the way I had always worked, which was to say she thought about the end before she moved the beginning, and she never confused activity with progress. When I called her from my bathroom that December night with the water running and told her they were accelerating, she did not panic, and she did not immediately suggest a countermove. She went quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that has something happening inside it. And then she said, "Tell me exactly what you saw. Not your interpretation, what you saw." I told her. Nathan's voice in the hallway. The phrase she's been more alert than we expected. The 2 men in suits. The way James Corbett's handshake felt like a performance. The micro shift in Clara's face when I walked into the room. "The name Corbett," Margaret said. "Say it again." James Corbett. Another pause, longer this time. There's a James Corbett who worked for 3 years as a litigation support specialist for Philip Garrett's firm before going independent. If it's the same man, it's the same man, I said. I did not know that for certain in that moment, but I knew it in the way you know things when every piece you've gathered begins to fit together into a shape you recognize. "Then they're further along than I thought," Margaret said. "They're not just planning anymore. They're staging." Staging. That was the word she used. And it was exactly right, because what I came to understand over the days that followed was that what Nathan and Clara had been building was not simply a financial scheme. It was a production. They were constructing a version of me, a document-supported, testimony-backed, medically certified version of me that existed for the sole purpose of presenting to a court as evidence of my incapacity. And like all productions, it required props. It required a cast. And it required the subject to be unaware that she was already on the stage. The first prop I identified came from a conversation I was never supposed to hear. It was a Thursday morning, 10 days after the encounter with Corbett and his colleague. I had come downstairs earlier than usual, 4:40 in the morning, which even for me was early, but I had not been sleeping and lying in the dark had stopped feeling productive. The house was quiet. I went to the kitchen to make coffee, and as I came down the back stairs, I heard voices from the study, my old study, the one now filled with Clara's painting equipment, and I stopped on the landing because something in the tone of Clara's voice made my feet stop moving before my brain gave the instruction. "The appointment is set for the 14th, Clara was saying. Dr. Hessler confirmed." Nathan's voice, lower. "She'll never agree to see him voluntarily." "She doesn't have to agree voluntarily. We use the wellness check framing. We tell her it's a routine cognitive screening, that the company's insurance carrier requires it for executives over 70. She won't question something that sounds administrative." A pause. Then Nathan, slower. And Hessler is certain about the evaluation? Philip spoke with him twice. He's done this before. He knows what the findings need to look like. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. I counted them on the landing with my hand against the wall and the cold floor under my bare feet. "What about Gerald?" Nathan said. I've noticed him being careful around me lately, like he's watching." "Gerald is an employee," Clara said. "When this is finalized, his position depends on our goodwill. He'll understand that." I went back upstairs. I did not make coffee. I sat on the edge of my bed, and I let myself feel for exactly 3 minutes the full weight of what I had just heard. I allowed myself that. 3 minutes of sitting with the knowledge that my son, the boy I had put through school, through college, through every financial difficulty of his adult life, was standing in my study at 4:40 in the morning discussing how to use a corrupted physician to have me declared incompetent. 3 minutes. Then I picked up my phone and texted Margaret, "Need to meet today. Not tomorrow. Today." She texted back within 4 minutes, which told me she was already awake, which told me something about the kind of person she was. Noon. Same location. I put the phone down and started thinking about Dr. Hessler. It took Diane less than 48 hours to find him. Dr. Raymond Hessler, geriatric psychiatrist, formerly affiliated with a hospital network in Fairfax County, currently operating a private practice in McLean. His record with the Virginia Board of Medicine was clean on the surface, but Diane, who had spent 22 years learning where people buried things, found a civil settlement from 6 years earlier involving a disputed competency evaluation in an estate case. The settlement terms were sealed, but the fact of the settlement was public record, and the plaintiff in that case had been the adult daughter of an elderly man whose conservatorship had subsequently been overturned by an appellate court. Diane sent me the summary. I sent it to Margaret. Margaret called me 20 minutes later. "This is the piece we needed," she said, and her voice had that particular quality it got when something she'd been working toward had finally clicked into alignment. A physician with a documented history of providing evaluations that get overturned, that undermines the entire medical track of their case, and it opens them to additional liability for suborning a fraudulent professional opinion. "Can we use it preemptively?" I asked. "We can do something better than preemptive," she said. "We let them conduct the evaluation." I went still. "Hear me out," she said. "If you refuse the evaluation, if you don't show up or you lawyer up visibly right now, they accelerate everything. They file the conservatorship petition based on what they already have and claim your refusal to cooperate is itself evidence of impairment. But if you go to that evaluation, if you sit down with Dr. Hessler and you present exactly as what you are, which is a fully competent 74-year-old woman with complete command of her faculties, then one of two things happens. Either Hessler produces a clean evaluation, which he can't then use, or he produces a fraudulent one, which we then challenge with everything Diane has found, and the fraudulent evaluation becomes the evidence that destroys their entire case." I thought about sitting in a room with a man who had been paid to find me lacking, answering his questions, performing my own coherence for an audience that had already written the ending. "And while I'm doing that," I said. "While you're doing that, we file," Margaret said. "The civil action for financial fraud that goes in the same week as the evaluation, quietly, through federal court. The criminal referral to the Financial Crimes Unit goes in the same week. And we file a separate action against Philip Garrett's firm for the conservatorship conspiracy. We time everything to land simultaneously, so there's no single pressure point they can respond to. They will be managing 4 fires at once, and none of those fires will be in a location they expected." I was quiet for a moment. "Evelyn," Margaret said, "I've done this 4 times. The part that always decides it is this part, whether the person we're defending can hold themselves together long enough to let the process work. Because the process, if we execute it correctly, is overwhelming. What they're doing is wrong, and it is documentable, and it will not survive serious legal scrutiny, but it requires you to keep going to dinner every night and acting like you don't know what you know." "I've been doing that for 2 months," I said. "I know you have." Schedule the evaluation. The evaluation was set for the 14th, which gave us 12 days. 12 days during which I went to the office every morning, reviewed documents, met with vendors, signed contracts, attended the board meeting for which I had been quietly preparing a very specific set of questions that I wanted on the record. At home, I ate dinner at the table with Nathan and Clara, and I listened and I watched and I added to my notebook when I was alone. The things I added during those 12 days are the things I have the most difficulty writing about now, because they were small. The small things are always the worst. Nathan began during this period a habit of stopping by my office doorway at the end of the workday and asking how I was feeling, not how my day had gone, not whether I had finished the vendor review, how I was feeling. The emphasis was slight, so slight that if you hadn't known what you were hearing, you would have thought it was concern. Clara called my cell phone on a Tuesday afternoon for no stated reason, just to chat. We spoke for 11 minutes. She mentioned 3 times in 3 different phrasings that I had seemed confused about something at dinner the previous week. I had not been confused. What I had done was misremember momentarily the name of a restaurant we had discussed. Clara remembered it differently, as a moment of significant disorientation, a gap in my cognition, a worrying sign. She was very gentle about it. She was practicing, I realized, practicing the version of that story she would need to tell. The morning of the 14th, I drove to Dr. Hessler's office in McLean alone. I wore the gray blazer I had bought for the deposition in the 2009 contract dispute, which I had won. I brought nothing with me except my wallet and my phone, and the knowledge that Margaret's assistant had filed the first of our civil actions in federal court at 8 that morning, 47 minutes before my appointment. Hessler's office was in a medical building off Old Dominion Drive. Tasteful waiting room, soft lighting, the kind of designed calm that always makes me slightly suspicious. His receptionist was friendly. I waited 9 minutes, which I counted because counting things was something I was doing a lot of during this period as a way of staying anchored. Dr. Raymond Hessler was 61 years old and had the smooth confidence of a man who had operated without meaningful consequence for most of his professional life. He shook my hand warmly and offered me water, which I accepted. He gestured to a chair across from his desk, and I sat in it with my back straight and my hands in my lap. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, settling into his own chair. "Thank you for coming in today. I understand this is a routine evaluation required by your company's insurance carrier." "That's my understanding as well," I said. He smiled. "Nothing to worry about. We'll just have a conversation. I may ask you some questions. We'll go through a few standard assessments. Very straightforward." "Of course," I said. He asked me to state my full name, my date of birth, my current address, the day of the week, the month, the year. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. He asked me to repeat a sequence of words after a delay. He asked me about my professional history, my educational background, my relationship with my son. I answered every question precisely. Where precision was not possible, I said so. When he asked me about my relationship with Nathan, I described it in terms that were warm and careful and told him nothing he could use. I watched his pen move on his notepad, and I watched his face move through its professional expressions, and I thought about Roland sitting across from me at our kitchen table with mortgage papers between us. After 53 minutes, Hessler set down his pen and said, "Well, this has been very productive." "I'm glad to hear it," I said. "Doctor, may I ask you something?" "Of course." "How long have you known Philip Garrett?" The pen, which he had just set down, moved. Not much. A small, involuntary motion, as if his hand had registered the question before the rest of him had processed it. His expression did not break. He was professional enough for that. But something behind it shifted. A tiny seismic event, underground, not visible from the surface unless you knew exactly where to look. "I'm not sure I follow the question," he said. "Philip Garrett," I repeated pleasantly. "Attorney. Conservatorship law. His firm is in Arlington. You and he met at a professional development conference in Baltimore in 2019 and have been in contact since." I paused. "I'm asking because I'm curious whether that relationship informed the scope of today's evaluation." Hessler looked at me for a long moment. I held his gaze comfortably because I had nothing to be uncomfortable about. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, "I'm not sure what I want to be straightforward with you," I said. "My attorney filed a civil action this morning relating to financial fraud within my company. A separate action has been filed identifying Dr. Raymond Hessler as a co-conspirator in a conservatorship fraud scheme. The Virginia Board of Medicine has also received a formal complaint, which was filed at 9:15 this morning. I looked at him without any particular expression. I wanted you to know that before you finalize whatever you plan to put in your report. The blood did not drain from his face in the dramatic way it does in movies. What happened was more subtle and more telling. He went very still, the way a person goes still when the ground beneath them has shifted and they're trying to determine whether it's still load-bearing. I think, he said slowly, that I need to speak with my attorney. That seems wise, I said. I stood, picked up my purse, and extended my hand. He shook it, not because he wanted to, but because his reflexes were still operating normally, even though everything else had stopped. Thank you for your time, Doctor. I walked out of the building, got into my car, and drove 2 blocks before I pulled into a parking lot and sat for a moment. My hands, which had been steady throughout the entire appointment, were shaking slightly now. Not badly, just the release of something that had been held tight for too long. I pressed them flat against the steering wheel and breathed. Then I called Margaret. It's done, I said. How are the filings? Federal clerk confirmed all 3 actions this morning. The criminal referral went to the financial crimes unit at 9. Garrett's firm was served at 10:40. She paused. How did Hessler react? Carefully, I said. He's going to call his attorney. Good, she said. Scared people who call their attorneys tend to cooperate. We may not need to push hard on that front. Another pause, different in texture from the first. Evelyn, you did well. I did what was necessary, I said. Sometimes those are the same thing. I sat in the parking lot and watched the December afternoon move through the bare trees along the road, and I thought about something Clara had said to me once, early in her relationship with Nathan, before any of this had happened, and I was still trying to like her without reservation. We had been in the kitchen together making something for a holiday dinner, and she had watched me work for a while and then said, almost as if to herself, "You never seem to worry, Evelyn. Doesn't anything scare you?" And I had answered honestly, which I probably should not have. Of course things scare me, I had said. I'm frightened fairly often. I've just learned that being frightened and moving forward are not mutually exclusive. She had looked at me strangely then. I had not understood why at the time. I understood now. I think she had filed that information away. I think she and Nathan had discussed it later, in one of those private conversations I was not part of, and concluded that it meant I was reckless, that I moved without thinking, that my willingness to act despite fear was a liability rather than a strength. They were wrong about that too. Being afraid and moving forward anyway does not mean you move without thinking. It means you have thought clearly enough to know that stillness is more dangerous than motion. Every real decision I had ever made, the mortgage, the company, the years of building something out of nothing, had been made in the presence of fear. Fear had never been a reason to stop. It had only ever been a signal to pay attention. I had been paying attention for 2 months, and now the board was set. What none of us had fully anticipated, not me, not Margaret, not Diane, was what would happen inside the house during the days between the filing and the moment Nathan found out. It was Gerald who told him. Not deliberately. Gerald was loyal and careful, but he was also human. And when Nathan came to him on a Friday afternoon with a direct question and a specific document he should not have had access to but clearly did, Gerald's face told the story before his words could arrange themselves into something less revealing. Nathan called me at 6:30 that evening. I was in my bedroom. I had been expecting the call, if not the precise timing. "Mom." His voice was tight in a way I had not heard before, not the controlled confidence of the man who had told me to move out, not the careful management of the man who had been watching me all these weeks. Something raw, something that recognized, finally, that the ground had changed under him. "What did you do?" "I protected myself," I said, "the same way I've always protected this family. You filed a lawsuit against me." The word lawsuit came out cracked at the edges. "Against your own son." "I filed several actions," I said. "Against the financial fraud that has been occurring within my company, against the conservatorship scheme, against the professionals who agreed to participate in it." A silence. Then, "You don't understand what you've done." And I almost felt something give way inside me then. because despite everything, despite every piece of evidence and every recorded conversation and every moment of clarity that had accumulated over 2 months, there was still some part of me that had not stopped loving the boy who had needed me once, who had been small once, who had called out for me in the night once, and I had come. But love, real love, the kind that does not hollow you out, does not mean allowing someone to take everything from you and call it family. Nathan, I said, I think it's you who doesn't understand what you've done. I ended the call. Downstairs, I heard Clara's voice, then silence. Then, after a long moment, the sound of a door closing with more force than was necessary. I sat on my bed. I picked up my notebook. I wrote the date at the top of the page, and then I sat there for a while without writing anything else, because some things, the weight of them, the way they press against your chest when you finally let yourself feel the full shape of what has happened, do not reduce to words easily. What I had built over 50 years had been targeted by the people I most trusted to protect it. And what I had built over the past 2 months, quietly, methodically, in parking lots and bathroom calls and 53-minute appointments in McLean, was the answer to that. It was not a comfortable feeling. It did not feel like triumph. It felt the way most real decisions feel, necessary and costly and not quite finished. It was not finished. Not yet. But for the first time in 2 months, the arc of it was visible to me. And what I saw, looking at it clearly in the quiet of my bedroom while Nathan and Clara moved through the house below, like people trying to understand a map that had just been redrawn entirely. What I saw was that the ending they had planned for me was no longer possible. The ending we were moving toward now was mine. The weekend after Nathan found out was the longest of my life. And I have had some long weekends. He did not speak to me on Saturday. I heard him in the kitchen early that morning, heard the particular silence he created when I came downstairs, the kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the active presence of anger being contained. Clara was not there. I would learn later that she had left Friday night to stay with her sister in Alexandria, which told me that she at least had the self-preservation instinct to put distance between herself and what was coming. Nathan stood at the counter with coffee he was not drinking and looked at the window when I came in. "Good morning," I said. He said nothing. I made my own coffee. The kitchen smelled like the soap Clara had switched to 6 months earlier. Something imported and faintly floral that I had never liked and never said anything about. I stood at the counter 12 feet from my son and drank my coffee and waited for whatever he had decided. "I called an attorney last night," he finally said, still looking at the window. "I assumed you would," I said. "Richard Hanley." I knew the name. Hanley was the aggressive civil litigator with a practice in Tyson's Corner. He had a reputation for prolonged discovery, tactical delays, and the kind of scorched earth approach that made opposing counsel dread their email in the morning. If Nathan had called Richard Hanley, he was not yet ready to think clearly about his situation. He was in the first stage, which was fight. "He says your filings have procedural vulnerabilities," Nathan said. Now he turned. His face was what happened to a person's face when they had been awake most of the night cycling between anger and fear without finding an exit from either. "He says he can get the federal action delayed by 6 months minimum. Maybe longer." "He might be right about that," I said. That surprised him. I could see it. "Then you understand this isn't over," he said. "I never thought it was over," I said. "Over was never the point, Nathan. I wasn't trying to end something quickly. I was trying to end it completely." I set my coffee mug down on the counter. "Richard Hanley can delay the federal civil action. He cannot delay the criminal referral because that is not a civil matter and the parties to it are not me and you. They are the Financial Crimes Unit and the evidence Diane Chu compiled across 18 months of records. He also cannot delay the Virginia Board of Medicine complaint against Hessler, and he cannot undo the fact that Philip Garrett's firm was served with notice of the conspiracy action last Friday." I paused. "What Richard Hanley can do is make this take longer and cost you more money than you currently have access to, since your company accounts have been frozen pending the fraud investigation." Nathan's jaw tightened. "Your personal accounts," I continued, because Margaret had instructed me to understand exactly what had and hadn't been frozen and why, are not yet subject to the freeze, but the Baxter Consulting Group account is. The property in Loudoun County is under a lis pendens. The Nevada and Cayman holding structures are the subject of an international financial information request that Diane filed simultaneously with the domestic actions. He was staring at me now with an expression I had never seen on his face before and hoped never to see again. It was not anger anymore. Anger has a kind of heat to it, an energy. What was on his face was something colder. The look of a person watching the architecture they built collapse floor by floor and understanding for the first time that they had not accounted for the foundation. "How long have you known?" he said. "Which part?" "Any of it. All of it." I thought about how to answer that honestly. "I started knowing something was wrong in the spring," I said. "I started knowing what it was in November. I've known the full shape of it since early December." He absorbed that. I watched him do the math. How many dinners, how many good mornings, how many evenings in the same house while I sat across from him and gave him nothing. "You never said anything," he said. His voice had shifted into something I wasn't prepared for, which was not accusation, but something closer to injury, raw and young-sounding, and for a moment terrifyingly like the boy he had been. You let it keep going." "Yes," I said. "Why?" And that was the question I had been asking myself for 2 months, in the quiet of my bedroom and the emptiness of early mornings and the long drive to Margaret's office and back. Not why did I wait? I knew why I waited. The strategic reasons were clear and they were right. But underneath the strategy, in the place where the real answer lived, why? "Because I needed to be certain," I said, "not of the evidence. I had enough evidence by December. I needed to be certain of you." I looked at him. "I needed to know whether it would stop, whether there was some version of this where you came to me and said that you had made a mistake and you wanted to fix it. I gave you time for that." Something crossed his face that I cannot accurately describe, a kind of fracturing maybe, the expression of a person who has just been told that the door they walked through without looking was standing open the entire time. "I didn't know you were—" he started. "I know you didn't," I said. "That's the part I've had to live with." I picked up my coffee and went upstairs, because I had said what needed saying, and continuing would only have become something else, something that served neither of us. On the landing, I stopped for a moment with my hand on the railing, and I breathed, and I reminded myself of what Margaret had told me in our third meeting. The emotional part and the legal part have to stay separate, or one of them destroys the other. I had kept them separate for 2 months. I needed to keep them separate a little longer. I did not come back downstairs until dinner, which I made alone because Nathan had gone out, and I ate alone at the kitchen table for the first time in 6 years of living in this arrangement, and I was aware that the aloneness of it was its own kind of answer to a question I had been afraid to ask. The first week of January arrived with the particular brutal clarity of a new year that has no intention of being gentle. Margaret called me on the 3rd to walk me through what had happened in the 48 hours since the holidays had ended and the legal machinery had resumed moving. Raymond Hessler had retained an attorney, and through that attorney had provided a proffer, preliminary cooperation, to the Virginia Board of Medicine investigation. He had confirmed that he had been approached by Philip Garrett to conduct a competency evaluation with a predetermined outcome. He had confirmed that 2 prior meetings had taken place before the December 14th appointment. He had provided email records. "He rolled immediately," Margaret said, and there was nothing satisfied in her voice, only practical, which tells you something about how well constructed the conspiracy was. When it starts to come apart, the pieces don't hold together. "Well, what does his cooperation mean for our case?" "It corroborates everything Diane found about the conservatorship scheme, which means that track of the case is now fully documented from 2 independent sources. Nathan's attorney can challenge the financial evidence, he can attack Diane's methodology, he can file motions until the courthouse runs out of paper. He cannot make Hessler's corroborated testimony disappear." I was in my car, parked outside the Reston Library. The January sky was the color of old pewter, and the parking lot was nearly empty. "What about Garrett?" I asked. Garrett's firm released a statement through their PR counsel saying they are cooperating fully with the inquiry. which, in my experience, means they are trying to determine whether their exposure can be minimized by putting distance between the firm and Philip Garrett personally. She paused. Garrett himself has retained separate criminal defense counsel, which is the most informative thing that has happened this week. Separate criminal defense counsel. The thing that tells you a person has stopped thinking about winning and started thinking about how much they will lose. And the financial investigation? Moving, Margaret said. The federal unit confirmed receipt of Diane's documentation. They've issued subpoenas to 3 financial institutions. At this stage, Evelyn, I want to be transparent with you. The criminal financial investigation operates on its own timeline. It could be 6 months, it could be 18. The civil action is more directly within our control, and I expect we'll have a preliminary hearing scheduled before the end of February. 6 months to 18. I thought about that. Then I said, I need to deal with the company's situation before the civil timeline resolves. The board needs to be informed. A pause. I was going to suggest that as well, Margaret said. Carefully, and soon. The Whitmore AgTech board consisted of 7 members, including myself. Nathan held a seat by virtue of his COO title. The other 5 were independent directors, 2 of whom I had known for more than a decade. I had been thinking about how to approach the board since December, turning it over at the edges without pressing directly on it, because it was the move that could not be undone and could not be softened after the fact. I called Miriam Park first. Miriam had been on the board for 9 years. She was 70, Korean American, a former investment banker who had consulted for Whitmore AgTech during the 2008 restructuring and joined the board afterward at my invitation. She was the most careful thinker I knew and the person I most trusted to give me an accurate read on something I could not see clearly myself. We met for lunch at a restaurant in Bethesda that was quiet on Tuesday afternoons. I brought copies of the key financial documents, redacted of attorney-client material. I set them on the table between us and I told her everything, from the Baxter Consulting Group payment to the Hessler appointment to the 6:30 phone call from Nathan. I told it plainly, without editorializing, because Miriam did not need my interpretation. She needed the facts. She read the documents without speaking. She had a cup of tea that she did not touch for the first 20 minutes. When she finally looked up, her expression was not what I expected. I had braced for shock, or distress, or the careful neutrality of someone who had not yet decided what they thought. What I saw instead was a weariness that told me she had not been entirely surprised. Miriam, I said slowly, what do you know? She set the documents down. She straightened them unnecessarily, which was the physical expression of ordering thoughts she was not sure she wanted to share. 3 months ago, she said, I received a phone call from Nathan. He said he wanted to discuss the company's leadership succession planning in a confidential context outside the formal board process. I told him I would think about it. I did not call him back because something about the call made me uneasy, and I hadn't yet worked out what. What did he say? He said that he was concerned about your capacity to continue leading at the level the company needed. He said he was raising it confidentially because he wanted to protect your dignity. She looked at me directly. He used those words, your dignity. I sat with that for a moment. He was building the narrative, I said. Yes, I see that now. She picked up her tea, found it cold, set it down. I should have called you then. I didn't, and I've been sitting with that since you called me yesterday. You didn't have the full picture then, I said. Neither did you, but you still moved. She said it without accusation, but it landed somewhere. I've been on this board for 9 years, Evelyn. I should have known what a confidential call from the COO about the founder's capacity actually meant. What it means now, I said, is that he was laying groundwork with at least some board members before he moved legally. I need to know who else he called. She told me she suspected at least one other director had received a similar approach, a man named Douglas Farr, who had been on the board for 4 years and whose relationship with Nathan had seemed over the past several months to have become warmer than the professional context required. I noted that. I would need to account for Farr when the board meeting happened, which it needed to happen soon. I'm calling an emergency session, I told Miriam. Next week, I need you in my corner visibly, not just present, visibly. You have me, she said. without hesitation, which was the thing I had hoped for and was still grateful to receive. The emergency board meeting was set for the second Thursday in January. Nathan's attorney filed a motion on the Tuesday before it, seeking to prevent me from conducting company business during what his filing described as an active legal dispute that creates a conflict of interest for the executive chairperson. Margaret anticipated this and had a response filed within 4 hours that cited 3 precedents establishing that a controlling shareholder's active defense of their ownership interest did not constitute a conflict of interest in the management of that interest. The motion was denied on Wednesday morning. I drove to the Whitmore AgTech headquarters on Thursday with a folder under my arm containing a 12-page documented summary that Margaret and Diane had prepared jointly, financial fraud evidence, the conservatorship scheme, Hessler's proffer, Garrett's criminal defense filing, the full architecture of what had been built inside my company over 18 months. Gerald Foss met me in the parking lot, which I had not asked him to do, and which told me everything I needed to know about where he stood. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. He was 62 and had the particular posture of a man who had been carrying something heavy for longer than he wanted. "Gerald," I said, "are you all right?" He adjusted his glasses. "I owe you an apology." "You don't." "I knew things weren't right," he said. I wasn't certain enough to bring it to you directly, and I told myself I was being careful, but honestly, I think I was being afraid." I looked at him. "You sent me the quarterly summary that had the Baxter payment in it." "Yes." "You sent me the Baxter contract when I asked." "Yes." "And when Nathan asked you directly whether I was aware of his legal exposure, your face told him enough that he called me." Gerald blinked. "I didn't realize. You did exactly what a person of integrity does," I said. "You didn't lie for him, and you didn't betray me. Given the pressures you were under, that was not a small thing." I touched his arm briefly. "Come inside." The boardroom held 7 chairs, and today it also held a specific tension, the kind that gathers when people in a room know that something irrevocable is about to happen and cannot agree on whether it will be good. Nathan was there. He had not known whether to come, I suspected. His attorney had probably advised against it, and his instinct had overridden that advice because Nathan had always needed to be in the room where decisions were made about him. He was wearing a suit I recognized, dark gray, the one he wore for presentations he wanted to win. He looked at me when I came in and then looked away. Douglas Farr was there, seated 2 chairs from Nathan, with the slightly too still quality of someone monitoring a situation they had already chosen a side in. Miriam Park was there. She looked at me once when I came in, a brief clear look, and then she looked at the table. I sat at the head of the table, where I had always sat, and I opened my folder. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," I said. "I'll be direct about why I've called this meeting, because I think you deserve directness. And I think this company deserves to have its leadership situation resolved without ambiguity." I distributed the summary documents around the table. What you have in front of you is a documented account of financial fraud occurring within Whitmore AgTech over the past 18 months, and a related scheme involving the company's COO and external parties to remove the company's founder through fraudulent legal means. Federal civil actions and a criminal referral have been filed. A cooperating witness in the conservatorship scheme has provided a proffer. I wanted the board to have complete information directly from me, rather than receiving it through other channels. The room was extremely quiet. Douglas Farr was looking at the first page of the summary with an expression that told me he was reading something he had hoped would not exist. Nathan's attorney had presumably told him to say nothing in this room. He said something anyway. "Mom." His voice came out wrong, too controlled in some places and not controlled enough in others. "This is not the place." "Nathan." I looked at him. "You are here in your capacity as a board member and company officer. If you have statements to make in that capacity, your attorney can make them through the appropriate channels. If you would like to speak to me as my son, that is a different conversation, and it will happen in a different room." He closed his mouth. Farr cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitmore, I want to be certain I understand the nature of the board's role here. Are you asking us to vote on..." I'm informing the board of a situation it has an obligation to be informed of, I said. Any actions the board takes as a result of that information are at the board's discretion. What I'm asking you to do today is read what's in front of you and understand what has been happening inside this company. One of the other directors, a woman named Sherry Alcott, who had joined the board 2 years earlier and rarely spoke first, said quietly, "How long have you known?" "The full picture, since December," I said. "Why didn't you bring it to the board sooner?" It was a fair question, and I had prepared an honest answer. Because bringing it to the board prematurely would have required me to name a board member as potentially compromised, without sufficient evidence to make that case cleanly. I did not look it far. I did not need to. I needed the legal process to advance to the point where the documentation was complete. That point has been reached. Sherry nodded slowly. She looked at the summary again. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. Nathan sat in silence for most of it, which was the most painful thing to watch. Not because I wanted him to fight, but because the silence looked less like legal strategy and more like a person sitting with the understanding of what they had done. When the board voted, at Margaret's recommendation, to place Nathan's operational access on administrative hold pending resolution of the legal proceedings, he did not object. He gathered his copy of the summary, which he had barely looked at, and he stood up. At the door he stopped. He did not turn around. He spoke to the door or the hallway beyond it, or possibly to no one. "I told myself it was what was best for the company," he said. For a while I actually believed that." No one in the room responded. I did not respond. There was nothing to say to that which wouldn't have made it worse for both of us. He left. The boardroom did not exhale so much as it recalibrated, slowly, the way a space does when something that had been pressing against it from inside has been removed. Miriam caught my eye across the table. She gave me nothing, just a steady look that meant she had seen all of it and was still in the room, and that was enough. The weeks that followed the board meeting had a quality I had not anticipated. They were exhausting in a completely different way from everything that had come before. The active threat period, the weeks of watching and not speaking, of parking lot phone calls and bathroom conversations, had required a specific kind of tension, a coiling, everything directed toward a point in the future. What came after was the uncoiling, the long, unglamorous process of actual consequence. Philip Garrett was the first to break completely. His firm, in the end, offered to settle the conspiracy action in a way that required him to provide full cooperation with both the civil and criminal proceedings. He surrendered his bar license as part of the agreement. The settlement document was 43 pages long and named every conversation, every meeting, every email, every step of the plan that had been built to take me apart. Reading it was one of the worst things I have done. Not because of what it said about the people who had plotted against me, but because of what it said about how they had thought about me. The language in those emails, the way they discussed my age, my memory, my physical presentation, the specific phrases they had planned to use in court to describe my decline, it reduced me to a clinical problem, a thing to be managed out of the way. I read the whole document. I needed to. You do not get to recover from something you have not looked at directly. Raymond Hessler surrendered his medical license in February in lieu of a formal disciplinary proceeding. The Virginia Board of Medicine's statement was 2 paragraphs and used the word egregious once, which in the careful language of medical regulatory bodies was roughly equivalent to anyone else screaming. The federal financial investigation moved on its own clock, as Margaret had warned me it would. But in March, the civil action reached a settlement conference that Nathan's new attorney, he had replaced Hanley by this point, which suggested either that Hanley had withdrawn or that Nathan had run out of the resources needed to sustain that particular approach, appeared at with considerably less aggression than the first filing had promised. The settlement conference lasted 3 days. I sat in a conference room for 3 days with lawyers on both sides of a table and documents I had gathered, and evidence I had protected in 2.5 years of a life that had been quietly dismantled around me, and I negotiated. Not because I was required to. Margaret made it clear that we could proceed to trial, and that the evidence strongly favored us, and that a trial verdict would likely exceed anything a settlement could provide. I chose to negotiate because a trial would have required Nathan to sit across from me in a courtroom for weeks, and have every piece of this read into the public record. And while I believed in the necessity of consequence, believed in it completely, had organized my life around it for the past several months, I was not certain that the specific form of consequence that was a public trial was the thing that served justice, as opposed to simply being the most destructive available option. I am not a person who mistakes destruction for justice. The settlement restored all diverted funds to Whitmore AgTech's accounts, with interest calculated from the date of each initial diversion. It required Nathan to resign all company positions and surrender his shares at a valuation established by an independent appraiser, not the inflated internal valuation his attorney tried to argue for, but a clean arm's-length number that was still, given what the company was worth, a significant sum. It required him to sign a comprehensive non-disparagement agreement covering the company, its leadership, and me personally. It did not require him to admit wrongdoing in the civil document, because that was the trade. His cooperation with the criminal investigation, which Margaret had coordinated with the federal unit, in exchange for civil resolution without admission. The criminal proceeding would determine what he admitted and what he did not. That was no longer in either of our hands. Clara's situation was handled separately, primarily through the Baxter Consulting Group matter. The consulting company was dissolved. The funds were recovered. Her attorney negotiated a resolution that involved her cooperation with the financial investigation and a civil judgment she would spend years satisfying. She and Nathan had separated by March. I learned this not from Nathan, but from a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it with the awkward, careful tone of someone delivering news they cannot gauge the recipient's reaction to. I did not have a reaction exactly, or rather I had a complicated one that I did not examine very thoroughly because I was not sure examining it would help me. The day the settlement was signed, I drove home alone. I parked in the driveway of the mansion. I sat there for a few minutes looking at the front of the house, the porch Roland and I had designed, the windows of the kitchen where I had made 30 years of family meals, the third-floor window of the room that had been my study before it was Clara's painting space, which was mine again now because Nathan and Clara had moved out in January, and the easels were gone, and Roland's reading lamp was back where it belonged, though the lamp was not original. I'd had to find a replacement. And the room was not quite the same, not quite the shape it had been before any of this, which was perhaps accurate. Nothing was quite the same shape it had been before. That was simply true, and I had made a decision some weeks earlier to stop treating that as a loss and start treating it as information. Things change shape. People change shape, under pressure, under time, under the specific weight of having been betrayed and having survived it. I was a different shape now. I was working out what that shape was. I got out of the car and went inside. Gerald had left a message on my phone earlier that morning. The Q1 numbers were strong. The vendor negotiations I had returned to managing directly were on track, and two of the junior product managers had submitted a proposal for a new soil analysis technology that he thought I would want to look at. I called him back from the kitchen. "Tell them yes," I said. "Set up the meeting for next week." "Yes to the meeting or yes to the proposal?" Gerald asked. "Yes to both," I said. "If someone brings me a good idea, the answer is yes, until I have a specific reason for it to be otherwise." A small pause. "You sound like yourself again, Mrs. Whitmore?" I looked out the kitchen window at the garden, which was beginning to consider spring with the tentative uncertainty of something that has been through a hard winter and is not quite sure the worst is over. "I've been myself the whole time, Gerald," I said. "Some people just stopped looking carefully enough to notice." Spring came to Reston the way it always did. Not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a cold snap. Tulips that pushed up through the garden soil in early April and then got punished by a late frost that turned their edges brown. The kind of spring that cannot decide what it wants to be, which felt, that year, appropriate. I had been sleeping better. Not well. I am not sure I will ever sleep the way I did before any of this happened, before I understood what I was capable of missing when I was not paying close enough attention. But better. The particular vigilance that had kept me awake for months, the constant low-frequency monitoring of everything around me for the next sign of something wrong, had eased in the way that a fist eases when it no longer needs to be a fist. Slowly, incompletely, with a residual tension that I suspected was permanent. Margaret called me on the first Tuesday of April with the update I had been waiting for. The federal criminal proceeding had reached its resolution. Nathan had pleaded guilty to 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit financial fraud. The plea agreement, which his attorney had negotiated over the preceding 6 weeks in coordination with the federal unit, carried a sentencing recommendation of 18 months in a minimum security federal facility, 3 years of supervised release, and full financial restitution beyond what the civil settlement had already recovered. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month. "He took the plea," I said. "He took the plea," Margaret confirmed. "His attorney called me this morning as a courtesy." I was standing in my kitchen. The garden was visible through the double windows. The same view I had looked at for 26 years. The same garden I had planted in stages over 2 decades, though the tulips that spring were more ragged than usual because of the frost. "How are you feeling about it?" Margaret asked. That was not a question I had a clean answer to, and I had learned by then that clean answers to complicated questions are usually dishonest. "I don't know yet," I said. "I think I need to sit with it." "That's reasonable," she said. "Evelyn, I want to say something, and you can tell me if it's overstepping." "Go ahead." "In 23 years of this work, I have handled 4 cases similar to yours: adult children exploiting elderly parents, conservatorship fraud, financial abuse inside families, and the resolution is never feels the way people imagine it will feel beforehand. People expect to feel vindicated. They usually feel something more complicated than that." "Yes," I said. "They do." After I hung up, I stood at the window for a while. The garden looked like it was trying. The tulips were damaged, but they were still standing, which was something. I thought about Nathan at 18, leaving for college. I had stood at the door of his dormitory room, a small, institutional space with a single bed and a window overlooking a parking lot, and I had watched him set up his desk with the specific focused energy of a young person who is excited about something without knowing yet what it will cost. He had looked back at me once over his shoulder with an expression that was equal parts independence and terror, and I had smiled at him and meant it completely. I thought about the year Roland was sick. Nathan had driven down from wherever he was working at the time, driven 4 hours on a Sunday to sit with his father for an afternoon, and drive back that same night because he had a Monday meeting he could not miss. I had not thought less of him for that. I had understood it as the particular bargain of adult life, where you cannot always be where you need to be because you are required to be somewhere else. I had told him it was fine. It was not entirely fine, but I told him it was, and I have wondered since whether that particular habit of mine, absorbing what was not fine and presenting it as acceptable, was something he had grown up watching and learned from, though what he learned was not the lesson I intended. I am not saying what happened was my fault. I want to be clear about that because I have spent time in the months since turning it over and looking at it from every angle. The way you turn a thing over to see whether it is broken all the way through or only on the surface. The choice to defraud someone, to conspire against them, to look at the woman who built your entire world and decide she was a resource to extract. That choice belonged to Nathan and Clara and the people they brought in to help them. I did not make that choice. I am not responsible for it. But I am a person who believes in honest accounting, and the honest account of who I was as a mother includes the ways I made it easier for Nathan to see me as someone who would absorb things rather than confront them, who would smooth things over rather than name them, who would protect the comfort of the relationship at the expense of its honesty. I had been doing that his entire life, and I do not think it served either of us. That is the part I carry, not guilt. I have been precise with myself about the difference between guilt and grief, because they live in similar places, but they are not the same thing. What I carry is grief. Grief for the son I thought I knew, grief for the years of small dishonesties I accepted in the name of keeping peace, grief for the version of our relationship that existed only in the story I was telling myself. That grief is mine. It does not excuse what he did. It does not change the outcome. It simply lives in me alongside everything else, which is how grief works. The sentencing hearing happened on a Thursday morning in May. I did not attend. Margaret had discussed with me whether I wanted to, and I had decided against it, and she had respected that decision without pressing for my reasoning, which is one of the things I valued most about her. My reasoning, which I did not fully articulate even to myself until after the fact, was this. I had spent the better part of a year watching Nathan in rooms, reading his face, monitoring his reactions, measuring my own against his. I needed the sentencing to be something that happened without me watching. I needed there to be at least one part of this that I was not present for, so that there was at least one part of it that did not require me to decide what my face should be doing. Margaret called me afterward at noon from the courthouse steps. 14 months, she said, lower end of the recommendation. The judge cited his cooperation with the financial investigation and his lack of prior criminal history. 14 months. I had expected 18. The number landed differently than I anticipated, not with relief and not with disappointment, but with a kind of neutral weight. A fact. One more fact in a long accumulation of facts, none of which had felt like enough by themselves, and all of which together had changed everything. Thank you, Margaret, I said. It's done, she said. There was something in her voice that was not quite warmth and not quite professional distance, but something in between. The tone of someone who has gone through a hard thing alongside another person and respects them for how they went through it. What will you do now? Work, I said. I've been neglecting the soil analysis project. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Good. That sounds right. Otinamas. The soil analysis project had been proposed by the two junior product managers. A young woman named Keziah Adeyemi, who had joined the company 18 months earlier straight out of graduate school, and her colleague Marcus Tran, who had been with us for 3 years, and whose quiet precision reminded me in the best possible way of a young Gerald Foss. They had brought me a 30-page proposal for a new sensor array system that could provide real-time soil composition analysis at the field level, integrating with existing farm management platforms. It was technically ambitious and commercially promising, and it solved a specific problem that I had been thinking about for nearly a decade without finding the right approach. I had told them yes in March, and I had thrown myself into it with the kind of focus that I recognized as therapeutic, even as I understood it was also genuinely necessary. The company needed it. I needed it. Sometimes the most important things are the ones that serve two purposes at once. Keziah came to my office in mid-May, about 2 weeks after the sentencing, with an updated prototype timeline. She was 29 and moved through the world with the specific energy of someone who has not yet been significantly disappointed by it, which I found both invigorating and occasionally alarming. She set the timeline document on my desk and pointed to the third-quarter milestone with a pen and said, I think we can pull this forward by 3 weeks if we contract the calibration testing to the Purdue lab instead of doing it in-house. What's the cost differential? I asked. She named a figure. Do it, I said. She looked at me with a slight surprise that she did not quite manage to conceal. Just like that? Just like that, I said. You've done the analysis. Your conclusion is sound. Second-guessing a sound conclusion is not caution. It's delay. I looked at her. How long did you sit on this before you brought it to me? She shifted slightly. About 2 weeks. Why? A pause. I wasn't sure you'd want to. I thought there might be a process I needed to go through first. Approval layers. There are approval layers for expenditures over a certain threshold and structural decisions over a certain scope, I said. A contractor decision within an existing project budget is not either of those things. You have the authority to make that call. You don't need to come to me for it. Okay, she said. Keziah. She looked up. You're going to do very well in this company if you trust your own work. And you're going to do less well if you spend 2 weeks deciding whether you're allowed to have good ideas. She left my office looking, I thought, like she was reconsidering something, not just the Purdue decision, but something larger, something about the nature of authority and permission that a lot of talented people get confused about early in their careers. I watched her go and felt something I had not felt in a long time and had missed more than I realized. The particular satisfaction of passing something on. Not money, not position, not the empty form of mentorship that consists of scheduled coffee meetings and advice brochures. The real thing. The thing where you say you know more than you think you do and you mean it, and you can see them starting to believe it. That feeling was the first uncomplicated good thing I had experienced in nearly a year. I held on to it. The idea for the foundation did not come to me fully formed. It came the way most real ideas come, which is sideways, through something else. I was in the archive room in late May, which I visited occasionally because I am the kind of person who keeps things. And the company's archive was full of things I had kept: early contracts, photographs, the original business plan I had typed on a rented typewriter in 1978 because we did not have a computer and could not afford to rent time at the copy shop. I was looking for a specific document related to an old vendor relationship that had become relevant again in a new context, and I found the document easily enough. But then I stayed in the archive room for another 40 minutes, sitting on the floor with a box of photographs from the 1980s. Because something about being in a room full of evidence of what you built makes you feel differently about the building. There was a photograph from 1983. I was 31, and I was standing outside the first real office space we ever rented, a proper office with windows and a reception area and a sign on the door that said Whitmore Agricultural Technologies in letters I had chosen myself. I was holding a set of keys and squinting into the sun and smiling in the involuntary way that happens when something has finally come true that you were not completely certain would. Roland had taken the photograph. He was not in it, which was always how it went with Roland. He preferred to be behind things rather than in front of them. I looked at that photograph for a long time. I had been 31 years old with a set of keys and no guarantee of anything. I had gotten here, through 30 years of work and one very bad year and a legal process that had cost more than money, by moving forward when moving forward was the only direction available. And sitting on the floor of my own archive room with that photograph in my hand, I thought about Kezia Adeyemi waiting 2 weeks to bring me a contractor decision because she was not certain she was allowed to have good ideas. And I thought about every young person who was sitting somewhere right now with a set of keys to something they had built or wanted to build, not knowing whether moving forward was allowed. I thought, someone should tell them it is. I called my personal attorney, not Margaret, who handled litigation. A different one, a woman named Sandra Cho, who handled estate and philanthropic structures, the following week. And I told her I wanted to establish a foundation. She asked me what kind. I want it to support early-stage entrepreneurs who have been overlooked, I said. Not overlooked because their ideas aren't good. Overlooked because of who they are, or where they come from, or who decided their seat at the table wasn't worth offering. Sandra, who had known me for 15 years and was not easily surprised by anything I said, was nonetheless quiet for a moment. That's a broad mandate. I know. I'll narrow it. Agricultural technology, because that's where I know the most. Women and people of color, because that's where the gaps are largest in this sector. And people over 50 who are starting for the first time, because everyone seems to have decided that starting something after a certain age is either impossible or suspicious. I paused. It isn't. No, Sandra said quietly. It isn't. I want it named for Roland, I said. The Roland Whitmore Foundation for Agricultural Innovation, and I want it operational before the end of the year. It took until October. Things that are worth doing take the time they take, and Sandra was meticulous in the way that people who set up philanthropic structures need to be, because the difference between a foundation that functions and one that merely exists is almost entirely in the documents you put in place at the beginning. We spent 5 months getting the documents right. The first grant cycle opened in November. We received 214 applications in 6 weeks. Kezia, who I had asked to serve on the review committee alongside 3 external advisors and myself, read every application and color-coded them with a system she developed herself and explained to me in a conference room with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of problem. I hired her away from the product team with a raise and the title of Foundation Director, which she accepted on the spot and then immediately asked whether she needed approval for the decision. "You already have it," I said. "You made it when you said yes." She laughed. It was the kind of laugh that acknowledges a lesson has landed. We awarded the first 11 grants in December. One of them went to a woman in her late 50s from rural Ohio who had developed a proprietary composting system and could not get a bank to return her calls. Another went to a 24-year-old first-generation college graduate who had built a water monitoring prototype in his parents' garage and presented it to us in a video that lasted 11 minutes and was, Objectively, the most technically competent grant application I had seen in the entire cycle. We funded him at twice the amount he requested, because the amount he requested told me exactly how little he had been told to expect. That was the moment the foundation became real to me. Not the legal formation, not the first board meeting, not the grant cycle opening. The moment I looked at that young man's application and understood that he had asked for less than he needed because no one had ever shown him what asking for enough looked like. I knew what that felt like. I had been there once. I was going to spend whatever time I had left making sure it was less common than it was. In December, Nathan was transferred to the federal facility in Cumberland, Maryland. I know this because Margaret told me as a matter of information, not because she thought I needed to do anything with it. I did nothing with it immediately. I filed it in the drawer with the other hard facts, and I let it sit there while I ran my company and built my foundation and repotted the garden tulips that had survived the spring frost. The letter came in February. It was handwritten, which surprised me. Nathan had always done everything electronically: emails, texts, documents. Handwriting had always seemed to him like an inefficiency. The handwriting on the letter was slightly uncertain, as though he had started and started again, which I could see in the pressure variations on the page. It was 3 pages long. I will not reproduce all of it here. Some things are private even now, even after everything, and the contents of that letter belong to the specific and painful category of things that were meant for me and for no one else. But I will say this much. He did not ask me for anything. He did not ask for forgiveness or visits or a lessening of whatever consequence he was living with. He said very directly and in his own words that he understood he had no right to ask me for anything. He said he had spent a significant amount of time. He did not specify how much, but the quality of the letter suggested it had been considerable, trying to understand how he had become the person who did what he did. He said he did not have a complete answer to that yet. He said he was not sure he would have one. He said that some things you do not get to make sense of, that sometimes the most honest thing you can do is sit with the fact of what you did without constructing an explanation that makes you feel better about it. He said he had been wrong about what love was. He said he had treated me like an institution rather than a person, like a structure that would always be there, that could absorb weight indefinitely, that did not require the kind of care you give to things that can be damaged. He said he did not know when he had started thinking about me that way, or whether it had been gradual or sudden, or whether it had happened so slowly, he simply had not noticed. He said, "I watched you survive everything, and I think I convinced myself that survival was the same as not needing anything from me." That sentence. That one sentence. I read the letter twice on the night it arrived. Then I put it in the drawer in my bedroom. The same drawer where I had kept Roland's letters, decades ago, when he was traveling for work, and we still sent letters because that was what you did. It sat there with Roland's letters, in the dark, which felt right in a way I could not have explained to anyone. I did not write back immediately. I sat with it for 3 weeks, which was the right amount of time for me. Then I wrote back. My letter was shorter than his. 1 page. I will also not reproduce it in full. What I will say is that I did not offer him absolution, because absolution was not mine to give and not what he had asked for. I did not tell him everything was fine, because it was not. I did not tell him I was angry, because by that point I was not. Anger had burned through the available fuel, and what remained was something more durable and less hot. I told him that I had spent a year understanding that protecting someone from consequence is not the same as loving them. That I had spent his entire life smoothing things over and calling it support, and that I had finally understood this was not support at all. It was a way of avoiding the harder conversation, the one where you say, "I need you to be better than this." I had never said that to him. I was saying it now, not as an accusation, as the truest thing I had left to offer. I told him I hoped he would come out of this as someone he was not embarrassed to be, not for my sake, for his. I sealed the letter and mailed it, and then I stood in my kitchen for a while, feeling lighter in a way that was not happiness, but was adjacent to something real. The following spring, a full year after the difficult spring, the one with the frost and the damage, the garden was different, not better in a simple way, more complicated. Several of the plants I had tried to preserve had not made it through, and I had replaced them with varieties I had not grown before, which meant the garden looked less like what it had always been and more like something in the process of becoming. There were gaps where I had not yet decided what to plant. I was not in a hurry to fill them. I turned 75 in June. Gerald organized something at the office that he described as a small gathering, which turned out to be 60 people in the conference rooms with a cake that was significantly larger than any gathering of 60 people could justify, and speeches that I had explicitly asked not to happen, and that happened anyway because Gerald had decided my preferences on this particular point were not binding. Miriam Park flew in from San Francisco, where she had been consulting for the previous month, and hugged me in the way that people who have been through something serious together hug, less social, more structural, like two buildings that have found out they are stronger when they are adjacent. Kezia gave a speech that I had also asked not to happen, and which I am glad happened, in which she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said that what she had learned from watching me over the past year was that competence and age do not cancel each other out, and that the assumption that they did was so widespread it had become invisible, and that making it visible was one of the most important things a person with my kind of platform could do. She said it in the direct, slightly over-fast way she said everything, with the slight flush on her face that appeared when she was saying something she cared about. And when she was done, she looked at me with a kind of defiant dignity that told me she had meant every word and was not going to apologize for having said it in a room full of people. I did not say anything in response. I just looked at her, and I think she understood what I meant by that, because she nodded once and sat down. After the gathering, when the cake had been eaten and the speeches were done, and most of the 60 people had gone back to their desks or their cars, I walked the floor of the company, the whole floor. The administrative offices, the product development wing, the archive room where I had sat on the floor in May with a box of photographs, the small break room where I had made coffee on early mornings when I was gathering evidence, the conference room where I had sat across from my board with a 12-page document and told them what had been done inside their company. I walked all of it, slowly, in the particular quiet of a building after a celebration when most of the people are gone and the space is just a space again. I had walked this floor when it was empty, and when it was full, and when it was under construction, and when it was falling apart, and when it was recovering. It had felt like different things at different times. Right now it felt like mine, which was not a feeling I had been certain I would ever recover. Let me tell you something about recovery. People talk about it like it is a destination, like there is a point you arrive at where you are recovered, the way you arrive at a town after a long drive. That is not what it is. Recovery is more like weather. It moves through you rather than settling in you, and some days it is clear enough to see a long distance, and other days you cannot see past your own windshield. What changes over time is not the weather, but your relationship to it. You stop expecting clear days every day. You start trusting that the unclear ones will pass. You get better at driving in conditions that would have stopped you before. I am not recovered from what happened in the sense of being someone to whom it did not happen. I am recovered in the sense of being someone who knows what they are made of because the year that happened stripped away everything she was not. What I am made of. I am made of 50 years of choosing to move forward when stillness would have been easier. I am made of Roland's belief in me on a kitchen table in Clarksburg, West Virginia, and of every decision I made afterward that tried to be worthy of it. I am made of the 3 minutes I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I heard on that landing at 4:40 in the morning, and of everything I did after those 3 minutes were up. I am made of sitting across from a corrupt physician and watching his certainty collapse, and of the parking lot afterward where my hands shook and I let them, and of calling Margaret and saying it's done with a voice that was steady enough to mean it. I am made of the letter I wrote to my son and the things I did not write in it that I also meant. I am made of things that were broken and fixed and broken again in different places, which means the structure is more complex now than it was when it started, more irregular, less predictable, harder to classify, and considerably stronger than anything that has never been tested. That is not a comfortable thing to be. I want to be honest about that. There is no part of what I went through that I would recommend as a path to self-knowledge. If someone had offered me the wisdom I have now at the price I paid for it, I would have told them to keep the wisdom. But no one offered me that choice. The choice I was offered was simpler, fall or do not fall. And I made the only choice I knew how to make, which was to stay standing. You, listening to this story, I do not know who you are. I do not know what you are carrying or who has tried to take it from you, or whether you are in the middle of the thing, or on the other side of it, or so deep in the beginning that you cannot yet see how far it goes. I do not know whether you are 74 or 31 or somewhere between, whether you are the person who built the thing or the person who is trying to keep what someone else built from being taken. I do not know the shape of your particular difficulty, but I know this. The people who looked at me and saw an old woman running out of time were not wrong. That time was running. They were wrong about what that meant. Time running does not mean you are finished. It means you do not have any to waste. Do not waste it on people who have decided what you are before they have looked carefully. Do not waste it absorbing what is not fine and calling it acceptable. Do not waste it maintaining the form of relationships that have lost the substance, the dinners, the niceties, the careful management of other people's comfort at the expense of your own dignity. None of that is love. Love is not what stays silent to keep the peace. Love is what says, I need you to be better than this, even when that sentence is the hardest thing you have ever said out loud. And if someone in your life, say, someone who shares your blood, your home, your history, looks at your age or your circumstances or your softness and decides those things make you manageable, I want you to remember something. Softness is not weakness. Patience is not passivity. An aging woman who has stopped arguing is not a woman who has given up. She is very possibly a woman who is watching carefully and writing things down. The notebook is still in my closet. Behind the panel Roland built. I have not thrown it away because I am not the kind of person who throws away evidence of her own history, even the parts that were hard to live through, especially those parts. The hard parts are the parts that tell you what you are made of, and I worked too long to find that out to discard the record of it. The soil analysis project shipped its first commercial units in September. Kezia flew to the demonstration in Des Moines with Marcus and 2 engineers and called me from the event floor with the background noise of an agricultural technology expo behind her, talking too fast and laughing in the middle of sentences because it had worked. It had actually worked. The sensors were reading accurately, and the platform integration was clean, and a distribution company from the Midwest had already placed an initial order. I sat in my office in Reston and listened to her and felt something that was not pride. Exactly. Pride is too small a word for what it feels like when something you built outlasts the worst year of your life and keeps going. It is something closer to confirmation, like the answer to a question you were afraid to ask. Mrs. Whitmore? Kezia said when I had been quiet for a moment. I'm here, I said. Are you? Did you hear all of that? Every word, I said. Are you happy? I thought about that question with the seriousness it deserved. Happy was not precisely the right word, for all the same reasons that recovered was not precisely the right word. What I was, sitting in the office of the company I had built and rebuilt and defended, with Roland's photograph on my desk, and a foundation bearing his name that had just funded its first round of people who needed someone to believe in them. What I was present, fully, entirely, unambiguously present in my own life. After everything they tried to take, that was what I had kept. Yes, I told Keziah. I'm happy. Outside my window, the October trees were turning. The Virginia fall had come in the particular way that Virginia fall comes, all at once. Seemingly overnight, the whole world deciding simultaneously to show what it had been hiding all summer. Red and gold and the specific amber that exists only for 2 or 3 weeks before it is gone. The color that reminds you every year that the most beautiful things are also the most temporary. That impermanence is not the opposite of worth. That something does not have to last forever to have been worth everything it cost. I sat at my desk in the company I built, and I watched the trees turn. And I thought about Roland with the mortgage papers, and Kezia with her color-coded applications, and the young man from Ohio who had asked for less than he needed, and a 3-page letter written in uncertain handwriting, and a garden that was growing into something different from what it had been. I thought about 74 years of choosing to be someone you could not manage. I thought about the cost of it, and about the other cost, the one you pay when you decide not to be that person, when you decide to be smaller than you are in order to make someone else more comfortable. I had paid both costs at different points, and I knew which one left you with something worth keeping. I was 75 years old. I had a company to run, a foundation to build, a garden to figure out, and a drawer full of letters I kept for the same reason I kept everything. Because the record matters. Because what happened to you is yours, and no one gets to take the record of it, and somewhere in that record is the evidence of who you actually were when the thing that tested you finally arrived. I was still here. That was the evidence. That was the whole story and the beginning of the next one, and I was not finished with either. I did not say anything in response. I just looked at her, and I think she understood what I meant by that, because she nodded once and sat down. After the gathering, when the cake had been eaten and the speeches were done and most of the 60 people had gone back to their desks or their cars, I walked the floor of the company, the whole floor, the administrative offices, the product development wing, the archive room where I had sat on the floor in May with a box of photographs, the small break room where I had made coffee on early mornings when I was gathering evidence, the conference room where I had sat across from my board with a 12-page document and told them what had been done inside their company. I walked all of it, slowly, in the particular quiet of a building after a celebration when most of the people are gone and the space is just a space again. I had walked this floor when it was empty and when it was full and when it was under construction and when it was falling apart and when it was recovering. It had felt like different things at different times. Right now it felt like mine, which was not a feeling I had been certain I would ever recover. Let me tell you something about recovery. People talk about it like it is a destination, like there is a point you arrive at where you are recovered, the way you arrive at a town after a long drive. That is not what it is. Recovery is more like weather. It moves through you rather than settling in you, and some days it is clear enough to see a long distance, and other days you cannot see past your own windshield. What changes over time is not the weather, but your relationship to it. You stop expecting clear days every day. You start trusting that the unclear ones will pass. You get better at driving in conditions that would have stopped you before. I am not recovered from what happened in the sense of being someone to whom it did not happen. I am recovered in the sense of being someone who knows what they are made of, because the year that happened stripped away everything she was not. What I am made of? I am made of 50 years of choosing to move forward when stillness would have been easier. I am made of Roland's belief in me on a kitchen table in Clarksburg, West Virginia, and of every decision I made afterward that tried to be worthy of it. I am made of the 3 minutes I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I heard on that landing at 4:40 in the morning, and of everything I did after those 3 minutes were up. I am made of sitting across from a corrupt physician and watching his certainty collapse, and of the parking lot afterward where my hands shook, and I let them, and of calling Margaret and saying it's done with a voice that was steady enough to mean it. I am made of the letter I wrote to my son, and the things I did not write in it that I also meant. I am made of things that were broken and fixed and broken again in different places, which means the structure is more complex now than it was when it started. More irregular, less predictable, harder to classify, and considerably stronger than anything that has never been tested. That is not a comfortable thing to be. I want to be honest about that. There is no part of what I went through that I would recommend as a path to self-knowledge. If someone had offered me the wisdom I have now at the price I paid for it, I would have told them to keep the wisdom. But no one offered me that choice. The choice I was offered was simpler: fall or do not fall. And I made the only choice I knew how to make, which was to stay standing. You, listening to this story, I do not know who you are. I do not know what you are carrying or who has tried to take it from you, or whether you are in the middle of the thing or on the other side of it, or so deep in the beginning that you cannot yet see how far it goes. I do not know whether you are 74 or 31, or somewhere between, whether you are the person who built the thing or the person who is trying to keep what someone else built from being taken. I do not know the shape of your particular difficulty, but I know this. The people who looked at me and saw an old woman running out of time were not wrong that time was running. They were wrong about what that meant. Time running does not mean you are finished. It means you do not have any to waste. Do not waste it on people who have decided what you are before they have looked carefully. Do not waste it absorbing what is not fine and calling it acceptable. Do not waste it maintaining the form of relationships that have lost the substance, the dinners, the niceties, the careful management of other people's comfort at the expense of your own dignity. None of that is love. Love is not what stays silent to keep the peace. Love is what says, I need you to be better than this, even when that sentence is the hardest thing you have ever said out loud. And if someone in your life, someone who shares your blood, your home, your history, looks at your age or your circumstances or your softness, and decides those things make you manageable, I want you to remember something. Softness is not weakness. Patience is not passivity. An aging woman who has stopped arguing is not a woman who has given up. She is, very possibly, a woman who is watching carefully and writing things down. The notebook is still in my closet. Behind the panel Roland built. I have not thrown it away because I am not the kind of person who throws away evidence of her own history, even the parts that were hard to live through, especially those parts. The hard parts are the parts that tell you what you're made of, and I worked too long to find that out to discard the record of it. The soil analysis project shipped its first commercial units in September. Kezia flew to the demonstration in Des Moines with Marcus and 2 engineers and called me from the event floor with the background noise of an agricultural technology expo behind her, talking too fast and laughing in the middle of sentences because it had worked. It had actually worked. The sensors were reading accurately, and the platform integration was clean, and a distribution company from the Midwest had already placed an initial order. I sat in my office in Reston and listened to her and felt something that was not pride. Exactly. Pride is too small a word for what it feels like when something you built outlasts the worst year of your life and keeps going. It is something closer to confirmation, like the answer to a question you were afraid to ask. Mrs. Whitmore? Kezia said, when I had been quiet for a moment. I'm here, I said. Did you hear all of that? Every word, I said. Are you happy? I thought about that question with the seriousness it deserved. Happy was not precisely the right word, for all the same reasons that recovered was not precisely the right word. What I was, sitting in the office of the company I had built and rebuilt and defended, with Roland's photograph on my desk and a foundation bearing his name that had just funded its first round of people who needed someone to believe in them, what I was present. Fully, entirely, unambiguously present in my own life. After everything they tried to take, that was what I had kept. Yes, I told Kezia, I'm happy. Outside my window, the October trees were turning. The Virginia fall had come in the particular way that Virginia fall comes, all at once, seemingly overnight, the whole world deciding simultaneously to show what it had been hiding all summer. Red and gold and the specific amber that exists only for 2 or 3 weeks before it is gone. The color that reminds you every year that the most beautiful things are also the most temporary. That impermanence is not the opposite of worth, that something does not have to last forever to have been worth everything it cost. I sat at my desk in the company I built, and I watched the trees turn, and I thought about Roland with the mortgage papers, and Kezia with her color-coded applications, and the young man from Ohio who had asked for less than he needed, and a 3-page letter written in uncertain handwriting, and a garden that was growing into something different from what it had been. I thought about 74 years of choosing to be someone you could not manage. I thought about the cost of it, and about the other cost. The one you pay when you decide not to be that person, when you decide to be smaller than you are in order to make someone else more comfortable. I had paid both costs, at different points, and I knew which one left you with something worth keeping. I was 75 years old. I had a company to run, a foundation to build, a garden to figure out, and a drawer full of letters I kept for the same reason I kept everything, because the record matters. Because what happened to you is yours, and no one gets to take the record of it, and somewhere in that record is the evidence of who you actually were when the thing that tested you finally arrived. I was still here. That was the evidence. That was the whole story, and the beginning of the next one, and I was not finished with either.